Today is April 20th, and I'm reading from Acts 5. Now, there's quite a transition that happens right here because we're reading about this wonderful outpouring of the Holy Spirit in the first 4 chapters of the book of Acts. And then all of a sudden, we have this shift of which a judgment of God comes upon that early church. This is probably a passage that deals with the dangers of playing church. So Ananias and Sapphira are part of the church. And they had some land. They sold the land, and they gave the proceeds from that to the church. What the problem was, though, is that they were implying that they had given the entire amount of money to the church. And so whatever the root issue of that problem was, it wasn't the fact that they could have kept the whole thing. They could have just given a portion of it, but it was the fact that they had in many ways tried to give the impression they'd given a lot. So it says that he kept back part of the proceeds. Well, Peter goes to Ananias, and he says to him here in this first few verses, "Why has Satan filled your heart to lie to the Holy Spirit and to keep back part of the proceeds?" And he says here, in the 4th verse, it remained, while it remained, was it not your own? In other words, you had the right to make these decisions, and it was in your control. Why, he says, have you conceived this thing in your heart? For you've not lied to men, but you've lied to God. In other words, it was all for show. It was all, the motivation here was just a pure personal gain. And so Peter then says to Ananias, it says that when he said this, that Ananias fell down and he died. And then it says, great fear came upon all those who heard these things. Now, a few hours later, the Bible tells us, verse 7, that his wife came by. She didn't know anything that had happened. And Peter then goes immediately to her and says, how is it that you have agreed with your husband to test the Spirit of the Lord? And then he says this, look, those who carried your husband out, the dead body of your husband, are at the door, and they're going to carry you out. And it says that she immediately fell down and she died, and they buried her and the husband. And it says great fear came upon all the church and upon all who heard these things. Now I want you to know something here. How did Peter know that this was going to happen? How did he know what Ananias had done, that he goes up to him and confronts him? Obviously, nobody whispered this to him other than the Holy Spirit. So we know that this is one of the gifts of the Holy Spirit that is mentioned in 1 Corinthians 9. It was a word of knowledge. It was something that he knew that did not come from a human source. It was divine source. And that's why then it's reiterated down later. He knew that she was going to die. He knew because he said, the ones that are outside the door that carried your husband out are about to carry you out. And she drops dead. That's a word of knowledge. He knew because the Holy Spirit gave him. And I think that we're going to see more of this activated in our day. But the point here is that God was not going to tolerate corruption. And so judgment fell in this situation. The church had been so pure, so full of power, that God wasn't going to permit it. And as a result of it, tells us in verse 12 that great fear came upon all. Why? A holy respect and a holy reverence, because they knew that this was God and that God was cleansing the church. Well, we move in the 12th verse, and it speaks about the continuing power that rests upon the church. And it talks about that in verse 12, that through the hands of the apostles, many signs and many wonders were done. And then this emphasis again, and they were one accord. How important it is for us to be in agreement, to be on the same page, to be unified in the objective that God has laid before us. And in verse 13 it says, yet none of the rest dared join them, but the people esteemed me highly. You see, what had just happened with Ananias and Sapphira was very fresh. And they knew you don't mess around with God, you don't mess around with his church. And so they, the Bible tells us here that they had favor. The people knew something was very special about these individuals. And so they were highly esteemed because they saw the finger of God activated in their life. Well, look at verse 14. It says, believers were increasingly added to the Lord, multitudes, both men and women. I mean, the church is just growing, just booming. It's just expanding. And then verse 14, believers were increasingly added to the Lord. And this is what we want. We don't want just a sideshow of signs and wonders and miracles. There's always a purpose, and that is God revealing himself, and the impact is they become effective witnesses and people come to Christ. In fact, it was so strong, it says that they brought the sick out of the streets and laid them in beds and couches, and that the shadow of Peter, it says, would pass by. And as soon as the shadow came over them, people were healed and unclean spirits came out. And how was that? It wasn't the shadow of Peter, but remember, it was what overshadowed Peter. He was under the shadow of the Almighty, as we read about in Psalms 91. And that's what's so important, is that we understand it wasn't the man, but it was what was overshadowing the man. Now, you go down in verse 17, you'll find that opposition comes. And the religious establishments just cannot stand what is happening. I mean, these wonders and these miracles is increasing their crowds, and the synagogue temple crowds are shrinking, and it's disturbing. They're following these fishermen and farmers, and supposedly these apostles of Jesus, and they're bothered by that. And so it says that in verse 17, they were filled with indignation. That's a very strong emotion, that there was a hatred almost. And they laid their hands on the apostles, and they put them in prison. And then in verse 19, let's think of this. That night, an angel of the Lord opened the prison doors and brought them out. Can you imagine? This is just, not just signs more. This is heaven sent deliverance. And what they thought they could constrain these guys, God sent angels. And I don't know what that must have been like when they were in stocks, and all of a sudden the angel comes in and says, hey, come on, boys, let's get out of here. But it's something. Notice the heaven's assignment conflicted with earthly authority. And you see here that there are times of which, even though we're supposed to honor those in authority, where there are those moments when authority is in contradiction with heaven's agenda or heaven's authority. So we know there's a higher authority. And so when they heard, look at verse 21, when they heard that, they entered the temple early in the morning and taught. So there they go back. They've been told they go back. And then the next few verses, verse 22, the apostles are brought, they're put on trial, and they're threatened. They say, hey, listen, they're amazed, though, because these guys are not in prison when they go to look at them the next day. And so they're probably totally, disturbed as to how this all came by. But anyways, they take these guys and they threaten them and say, what is this? What are you doing? And look in verse 26. Then the captain went with the officers and brought them out without violence, for they feared the people, lest they should be stoned. And verse 28 says, didn't we strictly command you not to teach in this name? They couldn't even say his name, name Jesus. And they said, look, you filled Jerusalem with your doctrine, and you tend to bring this man's blood upon us. So the guilt, conviction, all this is taking place. And I love the boldness of Peter. So he says we ought to obey God rather than men. And this boldness, oh my goodness, in the cutting truth of it, they said, they seem to preach the gospel every time, because from that point on said, hey, God raised up Jesus, whom you murdered by hanging on the tree. Him God is exalted. And so all of this is been placed there. What I want you to see is the fact that God was able to intervene in the ways that man was trying to block the movements of God. And I think that there are times of which obviously we've been called to obey those in authority over us. But there is a higher authority. And when those that are in authority over us are living or believing or giving us laws that violate the higher call, the higher law of God, then we ought to obey God rather than man. Well, listen, we're seeing the church coming alive, and in the midst of life, there's adversity and opposition. The powers of darkness doing everything they can to stop it. Well, thank God, the power of darkness has no influence whatsoever upon the power of God. Today, I pray that you'll walk in the power of that blessed Holy Spirit, and no matter the enemies coming against you on every side, greater is he that's in us than he that's in the world.